Oh gosh. Oh my.
Hey guys, Tyler Berger here with Bass Fishing HQ. Today I want to talk about 3 mistakes that you are probably making with a jig, so stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Guys, a jig is one of the best lures that has literally ever been created for bass. There's probably been more tournaments won on jigs than just about any other lure out there on the market. One of the best things about a jig is it's extremely versatile. You can fish it extremely deep. You can fish it literally in inches of water. You can swim a jig through the middle of the water column. You can fish a jig wherever you want. It can mimic a crawfish. It can mimic a bluegill. It can mimic a shad. Like I said, it's one of the best lures that's ever been created. And not only that, something that's really special about a jig is that it catches bigger than average fish. Sure, if you go out all day long, you might get more bites on a Texas rig, or you might get more bites fishing a different lure, but on average, it seems as though you get bigger bites fishing a jig. The thing about a jig is there are a lot of different types of jigs out there on the market, and I see a lot of guys make mistakes when it comes to fishing a jig, and because of that, some guys get turned off to a jig. They don't like to fish it, and I feel like they lose out on an opportunity of learning a really great bait, whether you fish tournaments or whether you just go out and fish for fun, because a jig can be a lure that's gonna catch you the biggest bass of your life. So today I wanna talk about 3 mistakes you may be making with a jig. All right, guys, the first mistake that I see a lot of guys make with a jig is simply not thinking or not considering the fall rate of your jig. The fall rate of your jig is crucial. I can't even tell you how important it is to understand the fall rate of a jig, which is basically just how fast that jig falls in the water. A lot of times when we fish a jig or a Texas rig, you're going to get bit on that initial fall. A lot of times is because of the fall rate of that lure. Sometimes a very fast fall can trigger bites, and sometimes a very slow fall can trigger bites. A lot of us like to use kind of the same size jig heads, right? We like to use a 3/8 ounce jig. We like to use a 1/2 ounce jig. Those are kind of the probably 2 most popular jig weights that there are. And a lot of us use those. It's comfortable for us to use. We know it's going to get bit, but sometimes it's better to really consider a jig that's a little bit lighter. And sometimes it's better to consider a jig that's a little bit heavier. A few times where I like a very slow fall is anytime I'm fishing colder water. If I'm fishing colder water, typically everything in nature is moving a little bit slower. You know, a lot of things that are underwater, fish, crawfish, crustaceans, they're all cold-blooded animals, so therefore they're going to be moving a lot slower. So I want to match the hatch in that case. I want something that's going to be slow. Sometimes I bump down to a 1/4 ounce jig, or maybe even less than that. Another time I like a slow fall rate is when I'm fishing muddy water. I don't typically like a smaller jig in this case. I like a bigger, bulkier jig, but I like a slow fall rate. Another great time to fish a jig that has a slow fall rate is when you're fishing highly pressured bodies of water. Something about that slow fall rate just gets more bites on a pressured body of water. Now guys, let's talk about the other side of the spectrum, a very fast rate. This is when you might use a jig that's 3/4 ounce or maybe even 1 ounce. Now obviously I'm going to want to use a heavier weighted jig when I'm fishing around heavy cover. You know, sometimes you have to punch down through matted vegetation or through heavy cover to get down to where the fish are. But sometimes using a very heavy jig can simply trigger bites that your typical 3/8 ounce jig and your 1/2 ounce jig won't trigger. So besides in heavy cover, another time that I like to use a heavy jig is during the summertime, especially during late summertime. During the first part of the summer, a lot of the fish are extremely active. They're first kind of getting out to maybe some main lake structures, or they're feeding up on bluegill shallow, and you can use your 1/2 ounce jig, your 3/8 ounce jig. But as those fish start to see more and more jigs that are that 1/2 ounce and 3/8 ounce size, sometimes I really think you have to make those fish react to your jig in order to get a bite. And the best way to do that is by using a heavier jig, a 3/4 ounce jig, a 1 ounce jig. Even if you're fishing extremely shallow cover, if you have a jig that all of a sudden just falls straight down, it literally creates a reaction reaction strike, like a crankbait hitting and deflecting off of a piece of cover, a jig that falls extremely fast in front of a bass's face. They don't know what to do, so they just bite it. If they can kind of watch it come down, sometimes they know that's not real. But if it shoots past their face, the only thing they can do is reach out and suck it in. So sometimes I like a heavy jig, something that falls extremely quick, that causes a reaction strike that fish doesn't even know what it's doing. There's a lot of things about a jig that will impact the fall rate. So I want to go over those few things with you guys quick. Now, first and foremost is the heaviness of the jig. A jig that is 1 ounce is going to fall a lot faster than a 3/4 ounce. A 3/4 ounce is typically going to fall faster than a 1/2 ounce jig. Now, with that being said, there are a few other things that can impact the fall rate of the jig. The first one is the bulkiness of the skirt. Some jigs that you will buy won't have a tremendous amount of strands on them. They're not a very bulky skirted jig. And then other jigs might have a ton of strands in their skirt, okay? The more skirting material that you have, the slower that fall rate is going to be. Another thing that can greatly impact the fall rate is your trailer. Trailers that are crawl style trailers that flap as they sink to the bottom. Those are gonna have a little bit more drag in the water, and therefore they're gonna slow that bait down a little bit as it's falling down. So when it comes to fall rate, make sure you consider all the factors that can make that jig fall at different rates. All right, guys, tip number 2 is really being one-dimensional with a jig. Like I talked about at the very beginning of this video, a jig is probably one of the most versatile lures that's in our tackle box. The biggest mistake that I see is guys just simply being one-dimensional. They only pick out a jig when they're fishing this way or fishing that way. And guys, I really believe that you should always have a jig tied on. Whether you're a bank angler or whether you fish out of a boat, you should always have a jig tied on and ready to go, because like I said in the beginning, if the fish are biting a jig, the chances of you catching a better than average fish, a big fish, are extremely high. And who doesn't want to go out there and catch big fish? Right now, I'm watching the Bassmasters fish on Lake Champlain, and something that I find really interesting in this tournament is yesterday was day 2 of the event, and Carl Jacobson was actually using a jig to catch not only largemouth, but he was also catching smallmouth fishing a jig. They're fishing on Lake Champlain. The first thought in a lot of guys' heads is probably a drop shot or a Ned rig or a tube, right? But here you got Carl fishing a jig on rock piles, and guess what? It's just something different. He's basically fishing a jig in a scenario that a lot of us are gonna pick up a different bait. He's getting bigger than average bites with that jig. He's able to horse those fish in and get them in the boat, and he's doing well in this tournament because he's not just being one-dimensional with the jig. He's fishing it offshore on rock piles on Lake Champlain in super gin clear water that a lot of us might pick up a drop shot or tube jig. So don't be one-dimensional with a jig. Always have it tied on and have it ready to go. All right, guys, the last mistake that I see a lot of anglers make is fishing the wrong style jig in the wrong locations. Now, something that I always like to preach on this channel is simplicity. I think a lot of times bass fishermen can just overcomplicate fishing when sometimes it just doesn't need to be complicated. And so with that being said, I'm going to tell you that if you don't have a lot of money to go out and buy jigs, go out and just buy you a green pumpkin and a black and blue jig, and you're gonna be set for the most part. And I'm gonna tell you to buy an Arky style jig head. That's gonna work in 95% of situations. You can skip it, you can fish it in heavy cover, you can swim it if you want. Just go out and buy that jig. Now, with that being said, guys, there's a lot of jigs that are created these days that really help you to just be more efficient when you're out there on the water. So if you can go out and buy 8, 10, 12 different style of jigs, then I'm gonna suggest that you buy jigs that really fit the situation that you are fishing. For instance, you do not wanna flip a football jig in grass, okay? It's not really going to work well. It's not going to come through grass very well. Now, jigs that are really made for grass fishing, you don't wanna flip them in a wood pile, but that's fine because it wasn't meant to fish in heavy trees and brush and things like that. So the point of this tip is really just try to make sure you fish the right style of jig in the situation that you are fishing. If you want to be able to skip a jig up under a dock, you want a flatter jig like that Arky style jig. If you want to fish offshore deep rock, football jigs were really made to fish on deep rock, and that's what's going to work best in that situation. If you can buy more than one style jig, it's really going to help you to be more effective, which is going to help you to catch more fish, help you to gain confidence in a jig, which is just going to be a better situation all around. Before I let you go, I just wanted to tell you the equipment that I like to fish a jig on. Jig rods can really range a lot depending on if you're swimming a jig, depending on if you're flipping a jig in heavy cover, they can range a lot. Anything though from 7 foot to 7'6" in a medium heavy to heavy is really gonna be what you want, something in that range. And I like to use a 7-to-1 or 8-to-1 gear ratio reel, a little bit higher speed gear ratio. Unless I'm swimming a jig, I'm not using the reel to typically move the lure. I'm using the rod, so I can get away with using a faster gear ratio reel. Now, when it comes to line, typically I'm gonna fish a 15-pound fluorocarbon to maybe 20-pound fluorocarbon. Sometimes if I'm fishing a swim jig, I may use 50-pound braid. And sometimes if I'm fishing finesse jigs, I might use 12-pound fluorocarbon. I don't typically go below 12-pound. I really hardly go below 15-pound fluorocarbon. This rod that I have here is a Okuma TCS rod. It's their flipping jig rod, 7'6" heavy. It's a great rod. It has a little bit more of a moderate action to it. It bends a little bit more down the rod, which I really like. Although it's still a heavy power rod, it bends a little bit further down the rod. Another rod that I really like is a rod that I have behind me over there. It's a 7'2" medium heavy Psycho Stick from Okuma. It is a perfect jig rod for skipping a jig, for swimming a jig. But whatever jig rod that you like to use, whether it's 7 foot, 7'6", as long as you're hooking fish and as long as they're getting in the boat or on the shore, stick with that. As long as you're not losing them, stick with your setup and you're gonna be good to go. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a thumbs up, comment below, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next video.